Living Power with Dan Hurth.
I want to do just a quick little recap from last Sunday, and then we'll continue with chapter 2 of Nehemiah. And the study guide you should have the study guides already that will cover all of that. But I just want, for those of you who weren't here, we're in a study of Nehemiah, and we're looking at the study from the perspective of discovering and doing God's will, God's way. Nehemiah is normally used as a way to teach about leadership and how to be leaders and make those kinds of decisions, and it is great for that. But my contention is that a good leader is one who does God's will. And so knowing how to make those right choices as a leader in God's will is extremely important. And so we're looking at this idea about doing God's will. Now, one of the things that's going to happen, when we get into chapter 3, we're going to be looking at body life, essentially, what the body of Christ is like, and how we fit into that together, and how all of us have different responsibilities and different jobs, and how God just knits all of that together for each of us to take on responsibilities that others can't take or shouldn't be taking on. And in that study, we're going to be getting into spiritual gifts. And we'll be doing some of you have studied spiritual gifts with me before, but we're going to open that study up again within that context of chapter 3 and take a look at discovering what your spiritual gift is and how do you apply it, and also how you misuse your spiritual gift sometimes. And so that'll be an interesting study. We have a test that's been developed over the years to help you discover your spiritual gift, and I'll be giving you all of that information. So you don't want to miss that study, and it'll be something I think that'll be very, very useful for you and for us, for you to know what your gift is and how God wants to use your gift. All right, but today we are in chapter 2, and we're actually in the last half of chapter 2. What has happened is Nehemiah, as you recall, discovers that the temple has been built, but it isn't finished. The wall around Jerusalem hasn't been finished. In fact, a lot of the wall has fallen apart. The doors or the gates have been burned, which basically means that they've been under attack, and that it just hasn't been finished. And Nehemiah is very upset about that, as are all of the Jews that are in exile, because that means that all that they've done in rebuilding the temple, and by the way, they had taken back a lot of the precious artifacts for the temple. All of those were subject to being stolen. A city that is unprotected is dangerous, and there were lots of marauders, and they were always being attacked. And so this was a difficult time for Jerusalem, and the Jews that were there that had come back from exile had just kind of fallen down on the job. They'd just gotten lazy and just didn't want to finish the job. There were a number of reasons why. Some of it was fear, some of it was just laziness, some of it was self-centeredness. There were a number of different reasons why. But it is important to know that they needed to finish the job, and Nehemiah felt like God was leading him. But Nehemiah wasn't in a position to do anything. He was the king's butler. Now remember, he's a slave, but he was like the butler, or sometimes he's referred to as the cupbearer. And his job was to tend to the king. And he is in a position where he can't do anything about the problem in Jerusalem, even though God's weight is heavy on his heart. Finally, one day, as he's serving the king notices that something's just not quite right. He says, "What's wrong?" Which was dangerous, because you were not ever supposed to go in the presence of the king with a sad face, a sad countenance. And the fact that he had done that violated the law. And here he was in the presence of the king with this sad face, and the king could have had him beheaded, because that's the way the law was. Instead, the king, who had a great respect, I think, for Nehemiah, asks what the problem is, and Nehemiah just opens up and tells him, this is what's going on. And the king says, "What do you want me to do about it?" And he just opened that door. It was just such a God thing, you know. He said, "Okay, what do you want me to do about it?" Instead of having him beheaded, he says, "Let's fix this problem. What do you need to do?" And he tells him that somebody needs to go and take care of this and make sure that the wall gets rebuilt and all of that sort of thing. The king wanted that for the Jews because the idea, Cyrus the Great, who had started this whole thing in this huge empire, wanted people to go back to their countries because he wanted them happy. If they were happy in their own countries, then they would at least be willing to pay their taxes, and they could live at peace, and that way he could control this huge empire. So they wanted these Jews to go back to Jerusalem, and obviously they couldn't go back because the city wasn't finished yet. So he wants them to go back, and he says, what do we need to do? How do we need to fix this? Nehemiah tells him what needs to be done, and the king says, and by the way, the queen was there. The queen happened to have been Esther, and the book of Esther is the story of that miracle, how God brought that about. And so Esther's there, and they say, okay, you're going to go back, and they give him the supplies that he needs and the authority that he needs to go back and do that. So God knew not only how to secure Nehemiah's release from his service as a slave to the king, but he also knew how to finance the project, and he knew how to get that taken care of. Because, as you've heard me say over and over again, God's will, done God's way, never lacks for God's provision. If we can learn that miraculous, powerful truth, our lives will be changed forever. God's will, done God's way, never lacks for God's provision. One of the reasons that we've struggled so much in our lives is that we think that we know what God's will is, and then, or maybe we do know what His will is, but we don't know what His way is, and we start doing things on our own and scheming, and things just don't fall into place the way that they're supposed to. And that's a pretty good sign that we've missed the boat somewhere, because God's will, done God's way, never lacks for God's provision. And so it's important for us to understand this very key principle, that divine vision can only be accomplished by divine intervention. When you sense that God is leading you and calling you to something, that divine vision has to be accomplished by divine intervention. So when God speaks to us and gives us this sense of destiny and direction, we ask how, but how is never a problem for God. God doesn't look at it and go, wow, how are we going to get this done? God knows how He's going to get His will done. And so it's not our burden of responsibility, it's God's responsibility to take care of it. It's our responsibility to simply obey as God opens the doors. And as I mentioned last Sunday, a lot of times we think it's our job to go and kick the door in. And it's not our job to kick the door in. Our job is simply to walk through when God opens the door. And when God opens the door, it's so obvious, it's so clear. Right, Pauls? You know, when God shows you what He wants, it's so clear. They just found a house, and they were mourning the fact that a house that they had wanted to buy just was taken right out from under them, and they weren't allowed to buy it. It was really kind of a dirty pool by the owner, but they were just kind of mourning that. And so what happened? God found them a better place, a nicer place, something that really, really worked for them, and they bought the house. The day they made an offer on it, the owner accepted it, and they signed the papers on it, and they're getting ready to close on a new house. That's just the way God does things. God's will, done God's way, never lacks for God's provision. When He opens the door, walk through it. Don't try to walk around and kick a door in or jump in through the window. Let God do what God does. And then when He does open the door, walk through it. What He originates, He orchestrates. So Nehemiah is simply responding to the king's questions. God obviously is leading the king to ask these questions and leading the king to respond to those needs. And that's exactly what happens in Nehemiah, in the last half of Nehemiah. So what can we learn from how Nehemiah got started doing God's will? Well, there were 6 things that we looked at last Sunday. First of all, you need to know what authority you have to do the job. When you sense that God is telling you to do something, what is your authority? And if you don't have an authority to do the job, wait. Wait until you have the authority to do what it is that you're supposed to do. Secondly, what resources do you know that you're going to need? And then let God become the provision for those things. Thirdly, expect opposition. Listen, just because it's God's will doesn't mean that it's just going to be smooth sailing the whole way. If anything, it means you're going to have opposition. And not only some opposition, it can be incredibly difficult sometimes. But again, that's just something that God has to take care of. Expect opposition when you're doing God's will. Fourthly, know what your motivation is. Are you the one that's that's doing this and pushing this, or is this something that God's doing? And I really believe this, and I live my life by this. Psalm 37:4. If you're delighting in the Lord, He will put His desires in your heart. That's what it says. It says, delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Well, what that literally says is that He will give you the desires of your heart. He will put His desires in your heart. That's how God will begin to motivate you. And all of this time you thought that the things that you wanted to do were wrong, because surely God wouldn't want you to do something that you wanted to do. When in fact, if you've been really seeking the Lord and delighting in the Lord, as He begins to motivate you, He will give you that desire to do those things. What a great way to live your life. So know your motivation. Is it you that's wanting to do this, or is this something that God is doing and stimulating in your life? Then make an honest assessment of the circumstances, of the situation. Take an honest look at it. What is it really like? What's really going on? What's really happening? Be honest about it, and be honest about yourself. And then finally, know that things may be worse or could get worse than expected. And that was what happened when Nehemiah took that trip around the wall. He realized, particularly on the south end of the wall, that things were a whole lot worse than he expected it to be.